Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to ESA's Federal Policy Webinar. We are coming to you live from our Portland office. It's beautiful. Mount Hood is back there, trust me. We have a little overcast, so not quite visible. But we're coming from Portland because we had an open house last night. We invited several of our clients and teaming partners and friends to come over and celebrate the new space that we recently opened in Portland. It was a result of some of the great work that we do with our clients. It allowed us to grow into this new space, and we're really happy to celebrate that. And it's something that we like to do to bring our teams together, socialize, build a sense of community, and really celebrate the success together. I'm joined this morning with Tony Overly, our Cultural Resources Practice Leader, and Meredith Parkin, our Environmental Planning Practice Leader. We're going to have a conversation around all the various changes that are happening in federal policy and digging into cultural resources in NEPA in particular. But before we do that, I have a few slides I'm going to go through to provide a bit of an overview and update on some recent happenings and dig into some policies and guidance that have recently been issued, and then we'll get into a conversation. So as we go into the presentation, I always like to just remind everybody we've got three branches of government, and they've all been extremely active. The legislative branch, although has not moved a lot of actual legislation into enactment, they have been introducing a lot, and they have a lot on their calendar. So we'll touch on that a little bit. The executive branch, obviously, has been very busy. There's consistently lots of policies and guidance and regulations and things that are coming out. So we'll track that a bit. And then the judicial branch. We've had some recent court decisions that are influencing how we do infrastructure permitting in the US. And so we'll touch on that as well. I always like to bring up these slides that kind of give context around how much activity we're seeing from the executive branch. President Trump has been very busy. It has been an unprecedented amount of engagement from the executive office. This slide here is just the first year executive orders. Now, this is not limited to the environmental permitting necessarily. This is all executive orders, but still it gives you a sense of the volume. So if you feel like you're overwhelmed, there's just a lot coming at you, it's with good reason. And if you look at the first year versus a full term, so a full 4-year term, still President Trump's 1 year of executive actions in this second term exceeds any prior 4-year term. So the volume is intense. There's a lot coming at us, and we're here to try and help you make sense of it. So the first thing I'm going to get into is CEQ recently released some updated guidance on the application of categorical exclusions, the lowest form of environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. It replaced 2010 guidance that they had issued, and it updated a number of key areas. Establishing and revising CEs, providing a little bit more direction on how agencies should establish their CEs and how they might revise them, what substantiation is necessary for CEs. It introduced some new concepts like relying on external or internal experts to substantiate. So historically, we've always looked at environmental assessments and FONSIs. You build a record of experience conducting the same action. And through that experience, you build a file or a history that says, we've done enough of these to show that this does not have a significant impact. This should qualify for a CE. Well, they've added some new authority here, or some new flexibility, I guess. One, the experts, and this really allows us to lean on expertise to allow us to CADX things that are emerging, that we may not have time to build up that whole substantiation history through EAs and FONSIs, but rather really look at expertise to say, through my years of experience in studying this topic, I can reasonably anticipate that it is not going to have a significant effect. Put that in some sort of a report and provide that substantiation to CEQ. And there's also the ability to rely on another agency CE. If you're creating a new CE that is very similar to another agency CE, you can just look to that agency CE as substantiation. It provides some guidance on revising or removing CEs. It introduces this new idea of a joint establishment of CEs, whereby 2 or more agencies that have routine actions that frequently occur together. I often think of this as like an Army Corps and perhaps a lead agency action, where Army Corps has a particular action on a project that would be separate from the traditional approach, and you'd have the lead agency do a CE on that, so you'd have 2 CEs. This would allow them to marry that process up, and you just issue a single CE. And then there's additional guidance on adopting a CE from another agency. Section 109 of NEPA that was created by the Fiscal Responsibility Act created the new authority for agencies to adopt any other agency CE. And so this guidance applies some additional direction and and clarity on how an agency would do that. And then finally, applying CEs to a particular action. It gets into some interesting nuance around how CE is perceiving the way that we apply CEs to particular actions, in specifically as it relates to extraordinary circumstances, and even the idea of applying multiple CEs to a single action. I'll get into that a little bit more. So one concept that was introduced in the substantiation section, it was almost like a throwaway line. It was buried in a full paragraph around the discussion around how much substantiation you need when establishing a CE, is this idea of a mitigated CE. Now, we know about mitigated FONSIs, where you have an action and you have a finding of no significant effect that is reached because you've applied mitigation that lowers the level of impact below a level of significance. This actually contemplates an agency creating a CE, and in that definition of a CE, they establish mitigation measures so that you would be able to apply those through the project definition, not as an after the action approach, but rather as part of your project. These are within the parameters of the CE, you would have a mitigated CE. This is, it's a new concept, obviously, and it'll be interesting to see how the agencies, how they use this new authority, and whether or not we're going to see more CEs built with that integrated mitigation component. So some key takeaways on the CE guidance. I mentioned the mitigated CEs. The last part of the CE guidance that really talks about applying CEs to particular actions really makes clear that extraordinary circumstances are not an automatic disqualifier for the use of a CE. Oftentimes, agencies are somewhat risk averse. If there is something that is unusual, that is outside the norm, the mere presence of perhaps a listed species or impacts to a protected waterway, if that were present on a project, they may not think or may not be comfortable applying a CE to that particular project in that circumstance. CEQ makes very clear that the mere presence of those extraordinary circumstances is not a disqualifying factor. You can perhaps apply mitigation, you can do some avoidance measures, whatever it might be, so that that doesn't kick you into an EA. And really, this is, I think, reflective of CEQ's emphasis here that CEs are the preferred path. If you have a CE available, you should use it and try to make the project fit into that as best you can. And then there's this other idea that was new and I think could be quite substantial, is the idea of applying multiple CEs to a single agency action. So for example, you have a development project where you are upgrading some utility work, you're upgrading some parking and maybe some access to it, and maybe you have a small expansion into previously disturbed areas where you might have a CE that covers one of those components and another CE that covers a different one. In the prior paradigm, you would typically go at this with an environmental assessment and a FONSI because you couldn't cobble together these CEs. Well, now CEQ is stating very clearly that they anticipate the ability to use multiple CEs. If you have one CE that covers one component and another CE that covers another, as long as you substantiate your record, you prove that there is not cumulatively a significant effect related to that action, you can use multiple CEs for that. I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And as you think about all of this new guidance and the way that we are using CEs, it can be a little bit daunting to figure out how exactly are we going to apply this new approach, and how do I find the CEs that may apply to my project? Now that we have this authority to adopt, of the 2,000 or more CEs that are available across government, how do we find the right one for our project? Well, fortunately, we've created a tool for that. You can see the QR code on the slide here, and we'll drop it in the chat as well. We've created a virtual assistant, a custom GPT that will allow a user to put in some basic information into a prompt, say, I've got this type of project, what CE might be available, or would a CE even be appropriate? And it'll spit out some answers, asking some additional screening questions, provide some candidate CEs that may apply, and also provide some confidence as to whether or not the ones that it has found are appropriate for the action that you've proposed. I encourage you to visit that. It is a new tool. We welcome your feedback, and I hope that you find it useful. So moving on from CEs, we do have some pending rulemakings. We've talked about these in prior webinars. The Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation process is undergoing some changes. The National Marine Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have both proposed rules that would really modify what was established in 2024, which under the Biden administration, which rescinded or replaced regulations that were put in place in 2019 through the first Trump administration. So we have this pendulum swing that's going. And after the 2019 regs, there were a number of environmental NGOs that had filed suit saying that the regulations as defined in that 2019 rulemaking were inconsistent with the intent of the Endangered Species Act. A Northern California District Court agreed with the plaintiffs, and they vacated those 2019 rules. That means that we are going back to prior 2019 across the country. The rules that as they are in place in 2019 are no longer in effect. And so now we have to think about, well, what rules were in place before 2019? How do we apply that? Way more complicated than I can get into here, or even probably that I understand fully. But fortunately, we have really smart biologists and endangered species experts at ESA, and they've written a blog about it. So you can click on this QR code that's on the screen, and we have a link in the chat as well that you can read more about it. But the takeaway on this is that because of the vacature of the 2019 rules, we don't know how the pending rules, we had a package of 4 in November, we had the rescission of the definition of harm prior to that. We don't know how that's going to play out. So this is a space to watch for sure. We also have the WOTUS, the Waters of the U.S. rulemaking that is pending. And recently, Lee Forsgren, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Army Civil Works, he was at an event in my hometown of Savannah, and he, in a much broader statement covering a lot of topics, he did have a line that got some coverage. And it basically said, we are, implying the Corps, getting out of the business of regulating wetlands. Obviously, that drew some attention. That's a pretty bold statement. And the Corps did come in and clean that up a little bit. Adam Tell, who is essentially Lee's boss, said that the point that he was making is that the law, it does require that the Corps regulate activities as it relates to the waters of the U.S., but that does not mean that it's all wetlands. So I share this because it is really signaling the Corps' intent to narrow the scope. And we saw that through the proposed rulemaking, but they are continuing to kind of beat that drum. And so this is also a space that we'll be watching. We don't have a timeline yet for when that final rule is going to be published, but they are clearly moving in that direction. We also had some developments as it relates to renewable energy. As you think back to last July, when Secretary Burgum issued a number of secretarial orders and directorates to Department of Interior that affected how we do environmental review and permitting for renewable energy projects. Essentially, there was the one secretarial order that said any authorization or permit or activity, consultation that the Department of Interior undertakes as it relates to renewable energy, wind or solar, it would be on or off federal lands, didn't matter. It would have to go through the Secretary's office. Well, there were a number of developers and environmental groups that thought that that was erecting an improper obstacle to the delivery of these projects. They sued the department on that secretarial order. A judge in Massachusetts, U.S. District Court in Massachusetts, found that the plaintiffs in that case were likely to succeed on the merits of their claim because the department did not follow the Administrative Procedures Act. It was, I think by definition, arbitrary and capricious. There was not opportunity for public review and comment, so on and so forth. So the district judge vacated or put in an injunction against the secretarial order so that they are no longer able to implement that secretarial order. And if you use the IPAC system from Fish and Wildlife Service, their online portal to initiate consultation, it used to have a banner at the top of the page that said, this is great for everybody except you, wind and solar projects. If you are pursuing one of those, you need to talk to your regional representative. That banner is gone. So they are complying with the order. However, just a few weeks ago, Secretary Burgum was on Capitol Hill testifying in defense of the president's budget, and he was asked about this, and he did indicate that he vehemently disagreed with the court's order and that they indicated that they're going to challenge it. But for now, it stands, and indications are that some renewable projects are actually moving forward. And finally, we are at a critical time for Congress. The clock is running out on a number of things. None perhaps more important for our purposes is the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was our most recent transportation authorization bill. It expires at the end of this fiscal year. So September 30 of this year, we will no longer have surface transportation authorization. That's important. I mean, that sets the framework for how we fund the Highway Trust Fund and how we fund transit programs, maritime programs, and the like. So we need to get that passed. And Secretary Graves, who's the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, had thought that he was going to have a discussion draft ready for markup in April, and then he punted to May. And now we still don't have a draft. So the clock is ticking, and we are also in an election year. So many of the members, the whole House and a third of the Senate, are up for re-election, and they want to get out of DC and they want to get back to their districts to campaign so that they can get their jobs back. So this is really putting a crunch on the calendar. This legislative calendar is getting much tighter. The timeline is not going to change. And so there's a lot of work for them to do. What's most likely, probably, is that they're going to extend the IIJA for a period of time so that they can buy themselves more time to negotiate. But that also means the permitting reform work that has been underway is, it's running out of time as well. It doesn't mean that, none of this is going to happen ever. But we seem to be in a moment, everyone seems to agree that there's consensus that something needs to be done. And if we miss the opportunity with this Congress, we may lose momentum, particularly if the House flips, and even if the Senate flips, you're going to have divided government, and it's going to be much harder to move some of these bigger contentious things through. We have the Certain Act, which was introduced by Representative Peters, that provides some durability of decisions. We have the Speed Act that passed the House and is with the Senate, which modifies significant portions of NEPA. Endangered Species Act amendments, Clean Water Act amendments, Clean Air Act amendments, and also we haven't seen language yet, but we've heard from members that they are interested in looking at the National Historic Preservation Act as well. So this is all on the table. It remains to be seen where we go. But as we think about the National Historic Preservation Act, I think it's worth bringing in Tony here to talk about what actually is going on. So, Tony, the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is required for any federal undertaking, and it requires you to do consultation to consider the effects on cultural and historic resources. How do you feel about it being, I just had it on the slide there, that it's part of the permitting reform discussion. How do you feel about that actually being lumped into that permitting reform bucket?
It partially makes sense. Really, Section 106 consultation and review should happen prior to the permitting stage, because the outcomes of that process should help ultimately the design for a project, and it should influence that design and also ultimately alternative selection. So it makes sense that people that aren't specialists in Section 106 kind of roll that up into permitting, but it's truly should happen before, because often the permitting process is really only the selected alternative, the actual project. And that kind of contravenes how that fits together. And so I think it makes sense now that we have this. It is a robust environmental review that is required to happen. So it really makes sense that it's getting now caught up in this general national interest to further accelerate and streamline our procedures. But it's technically not permitting. If you're in the business, if people that do this all the time can take a little umbrage with that.
Yeah, it does seem to be somewhat sensitive for people who are really focused on the 106 process. But so I showed, Congress is contemplating making changes to the National Historic Preservation Act, but the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation is the keeper. They're like the CEQ for NEPA. They are the keepers of the 106 process. They have indicated that they want to revisit the 106 regulations. What does that look like?
Well, they've done some things before that too. They've been this trend to accelerate reviews and streamlining has been building for years, and we've seen a lot of changes to NEPA and presidential executive orders, and so the council's been responding to that. There's been a few things they've done in the last few years. They issued several program comments, which is an alternative process they have in the existing regulations. They can tailor the Section 106 review for certain kinds of actions. Some of those have been pretty controversial by the preservation professionals. But I think the council was trying to work hard to show that they can be nimble with the existing practice that they have in place. They've also they're working on some funding. They got some funding from the Permitting Council, where you used to lead, and they've retooled that money they're moving into some additional AI-based digital data for legacy data, for information that's already known about existing cultural resources, and how they can maybe accelerate that process and review moving forward for projects within the existing practice. And their commitment to have that in place is 18 months. So they're moving. They're moving quickly on that. But yes, they did announce an intent to revise the Section 106 regulations found at 36 CFR Part 800. And the council are the keeper of those regulations. And even with the past litigation of questioning what executive agencies have authority to change regulation, it seems pretty certain under NHPA, under the act, that the council does have that authority to do that, and that's well within their space and their mission. And so They mentioned that they have a full quorum now, and they don't have a chairman. The chairman has to be appointed by the Senate, but the vice chairman, who's acting, did make an announcement that he wanted to look into the regulations. And in their business meeting in February, they did have a conversation about that. And I think there's four main areas that he flagged that he wanted to consider start talking about. We want to narrow the scope, thinking about defining the undertaking, and establishing the area of potential effects. I think the way to look about that is it's really syncing it up with some of the narrowing we've seen for NEPA. He's also, he mentioned cumulative and indirect effects. That's often a stumbling block for major infrastructure projects. And even though you use the term indirect, I think really what he was getting at under Section 106, we talk about non-physical effects, visual intrusion, audible, and atmospheric, which are a direct consequence of the project. So often that's still the rubric we call that indirect effects. And then the last two is managing, review, and scope for long linear projects with limited federal involvement. I think mostly transmission lines, maybe some transportation projects. Those are tricky because you have so many jurisdictions and large areas of land to consider. And then managing timelines for review, because some of the process for the later parts, they don't have milestone deadlines for how long those take. And so once you embark on that process, there's a lot of uncertainty in how long that will take.
Well, and all of that sounds pretty rational. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around tightening the scope of analysis for various environmental laws. But you mentioned that the preservation community did not react super supportively under the last administration for some of the program comments or program alternatives that they had issued. How are they reacting to this new proposal?
Well, last fall, that Senate committee hearing on Section 106, and I think there was a lot of, it seemed like the trend coming out of that was like, well, we did a good job explaining if we just had more funding and more resources and more employees, we could process faster because we do have, tools that can accelerate the reviews. But I don't think that's what this administration is about. This leadership is about is providing more funding. And so I think when the council kind of went there, the many industry groups, NGOs and interested parties and tribes and other consulting parties, all the state historic preservation officers, I think it got their attention. In their business meeting in February, they had to have an overflow room. They often broadcast that. For whatever reason, they decided to just do that one in person. And they had a lot of people come and give statements about what it would take to, from a resourcing standpoint, to accelerate reviews. But I've seen, people are writing letters in already to the council and offering up suggestions about what we could do to make these things, some reasonable adjustments that can be made. And I think there's been a large inward-looking, like professional introspection about maybe we haven't done a good job the last decades demonstrating to the public why preservation, of resources, heritage resources matters. We've been kind of speaking to ourselves in our own little echo chamber. And that's a long-term solution, but it's really important that the professional community acknowledges that, continues to move forward and engage on how to take into account our effects for these modern infrastructure projects that we need.
You mentioned that this administration may not be that interested in funding, the SHPOs and the TIPOs, but the president released a budget recently. What did it say about the preservation work that we do?
Well, so yeah, the proposed presidential budget for this year and last year zeroed out some of the cultural resources programs, major ones on federal land managers, proposed no funding at all for their staff. And of course, Congress didn't go there. They went ahead and funded at pretty commensurate levels to what they've had before. There were some haircuts, there were some lowering of reductions, but then even, for the hairs, there's a pot of money that goes out to the state historic preservation officers and the tribal historic preservation officers to help fund them. And even that money was programmed in there by Congress. The executive agencies were slow to release that money. It just got released for this year about a month ago, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Well, and as you think about, a decrease in funding and the lack of available resources, that obviously, across any permitting process or consultation process, that's going to create a bottleneck. Are there other pain points in the process that we're seeing that may be right for some of the reform efforts?
Oh, for sure. Certainly, the DOJ, the federal agency staffing, and there's just less people to process. The public, the tribes, and the state historic preservation officers, which have a critically important rule and opportunity to engage on these, they're resource constrained. But I think we're seeing pain points on both the small scale and the large scale projects. So on the small scale ones, where sometimes it seems like the consultation, review, and identification efforts take longer or cost more than the actual project and what the risks of those impacts might be. So I think, you know, this expansion in NEPA CADXs, I think there may be some kind of, you know, energy and alignment to see what can happen on the small scale projects to, you know, get the 106 review either more nimble or maybe eliminated. And then on the large scale stuff, the stumbling blocks around non-physical visual intrusions for major infrastructure is always a difficult process. Many specialists that do work in this field, you know, the first time they're dealing with one of those, it's very different than the kinds of projects that they're normally working on. And then also we've seen a real ramp up in litigation the last few years on, you know, there's some big stuff in the national press about some of the buildings in DC that are, you know, there's been some issues there, but there's some more procedural Section 106 reviews that have been a problem too. You know, one of the offshore wind projects that's built and been approved in the Atlantic was very controversial for some of the visual intrusions to heritage resources. But BOEM, they did the entire process through the Section 106. They took into account those effects, mitigated those, and had a memorandum of agreement. And they did the entire procedure correctly. But some of the NGOs decided they still wanted to litigate that, and they lost because the judge reviewed that. So BOEM followed the process correctly. And so I think that's not a satisfactory outcome for anybody. BOEM didn't want to defend that. The NGOs clearly were not happy with the outcome. And so those are all pain points. We're spending money on court cases instead of dealing with the heritage resources.
Well, and so litigation risks, the judicial reform is often part of the conversation around permitting reform, and it covers all the things.
Sure.
If you were chair of the advisory council or king for a day of cultural resource reviews, what does reform look like for you? What would be successful reform that it, you know, preserves the intent but also provides the efficiencies?
I think some schedule certainty around some of those milestones that don't have deadlines. Maybe there'll be some, you know, actual 30-day or some calendar stipulations in there. Definitely more predictability around the effects and how to define those and how to, you know, to think about identifying those timelines for resolution on procedures. And, you know, all of these things will, you know, when the council does, if they decide they're really going to embark on this, because it was just a discussion at the February meeting about, you know, setting up a working group of some of the council members to do that, was that there was a thought that, you know, they still have to do the full administrative review. They've published draft regulations. People will comment on those. They'll follow the Administrative Procedures Act, but because it's a regulatory action, they can go pretty fast. I think the last thing is certainly that I would like to see is a really more meaningful support for technical staff and all consulting parties, state historic preserving officers and TIPOs too.
Thank you for that. You know, Meredith and I live in the NEPA world most of the time, and we always think it's super complex and there's lots of changes, but clearly the 106 area is very dynamic as well. But Meredith,
yes,
as our environmental planning practice leader, lots changed in NEPA in the last year. What do you see as the most consequential?
and yeah, it has been somewhat of a roller coaster in the last year. I would say there's really two things that have been very consequential. One is the 7-county Supreme Court case, and the other is the rescission of the CEQ implementing NEPA implementing regulations. And I'll start with 7-county first. Really, the Supreme Court really limited that federal action of like, okay, we're going to look at just what this is, not separate projects, not activities that are outside of that agency's control. So we're really seeing a limiting of what that federal action is. For example, we're working on a large water infrastructure project that has a federal facility. And in the beginning, we were like, if not but changes to this federal facility, we would have these other projects that are going to have effects downstream. And now we've really limited it. The federal action is only that federal facility. We're not looking at separate projects, and it essentially, you know, cut it in half. So that's one. And then the rescission of the NEPA, the CEQ NEPA implementing regulations. We have the NEPA statute, which is, you know, really that framework, but it's pretty basic. And then we had these CEQ implementing regulations that had definitions. They kind of had like, it was a playbook of how you were going to do certain things. And while federal agencies had their different like guidelines, it was always kind of that with that backbone in mind. With those being taken away, now the federal agencies, we're seeing it vary greatly. For example, The Department of Interior released their 2026 NEPA handbook, and it's 100 and some pages, pretty descriptive, but it still like gives the agency like, how far do you want to take those indirect effects? Because 7 counties didn't take away that we have to do indirect effects of that project at hand, but they were like, hey, you have a little more flexibility in how far you go. The Army Corps of Engineers regulatory guidance is only 7 pages, right? And it's just like, whatever you see is foreseeable impact of the project, you need to evaluate. So there's a lot of discretionary there. So I think bottom line, you as a practitioner, we really need to understand what is the federal action, get that really well defined, and then also understand those agencies' guidelines, because they vary much greater than we've seen in the past.
And before we go further, I just want to take a moment for some housekeeping. There is an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. We will be monitoring that. I should have said that at the top. But we'll also be following up with some responses and some key takeaways from this. So, if you want to ask questions, we'll do our best to respond in real time, but we'll also be following up with those. So keep them coming, and we're happy to hear from you if you have questions. So Meredith, you just talked about a lot of changes. There's been the rescission of the regs, and we've got new regs that are coming out. How are we advising clients now as the ground shifts? And fundamentally shifts in how we approach NEPA. We have the old regime that we've been very accustomed to, and this new regime that we're still adjusting to. How do we balance that?
Yeah, I kind of see this in like 4 different areas. We have greater use of CEs that you were just talking about. There's so much more now about cross-agency, stacking, mitigated. So we're really seeing a greater use of CEs. The second one is the effects analysis in EAs and EISs. Because of 7 county, we're really looking at, it used to be like, how big are the effects? Now we're like, are the effects even there? Do we even need to evaluate those effects? And then I would say that the other one is page limits. We've been dealing with page limits since 2023, since the Fiscal Responsibility Act, was modified in the NEPA statute. But what we're finding is that the CEQ guidelines provided a lot of flexibility. They're like, you don't have to include tables, and you don't, in that page limit, you don't have to include figures. Certain sections were eliminated. Those are no longer. And so we also relied heavily on appendices. We were like, okay, we're going to have a lot of information appendices and then summarize it into the main body to meet those page limits. Those appendices cannot, many regulations are saying they can't have substantive information. So you can't really rely on them. So we're seeing that really just, it was already hard to get to 300 or 150 pages for an EIS. Now it's even harder. And then last I would say is the public participation. The NEPA statute has some basic requirements for public participation. And as we're seeing these agencies come out with these guidelines, some are saying that we're not even going to release EAs for public participation, and that's within their right to do so. Other than scoping for EISs, some are not releasing out as well. So we're seeing clients having to navigate that, because you can get a lot of information from the public on your project, on the alternatives. And so we're seeing many do that kind of public engagement separate from the NEPA that used to be included within it.
Well, and the public engagement obviously is a big part of the 106 process. So I want to come back to that in a minute. But it also seems like the lack of public participation, the lack of seeking public comment and engagement during the NEPA process can create some risk for the agencies.
Yeah.
How do we advise clients on allocating that risk in a way that they can manage? I mean, as you mentioned, public participation is a great way to inform project definition. You identify possible mitigation strategies that you may not have known about, because the local community has better feedback and understanding of the context. How do we manage that? How do we manage that risk and that engagement while still staying within the confines of the NEPA process as it's currently defined?
And it's such a good question, because I think there's several things that I would recommend. One is what I was saying before, really understand that federal action. Since it's being limited, there's changes to it. Let's understand that federal action. Let's understand the agency's level of review. What is, and what are the key assumptions that they're making? And then also I would say that knowing your agency's risk tolerance, some are still really conservative, some are embracing this, change heavily. So really understand how your agency is embracing risk. I would say document what we're excluding. We have the ability to exclude more things, but to really document that and why, so you have that as justification. And then always provide a defensible record. That's really important as we go through this, that you're always documenting and providing that defensible record.
Well, and one other thing that that we hadn't touched on, but I think is also important just to flag, is just the question of whether NEPA even applies.
Absolutely.
Now, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a threshold question, and there's more work on the permanent reform effort to narrow when NEPA would apply.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that's one of the things, like Jomar Maldonado, who is the Associate Director for NEPA Oversight at the Council of Environmental Quality, he was on a webinar just the other day and was like, this is the hierarchy of things you need to do. And first is determine whether or not NEPA even applies.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a strange place to be.
Yeah.
For us NEPA practitioners.
Well, it used to be if you had federal funding, all right, you're going to have some NEPA, and that's not always the case any longer. So yeah.
So as we think about allocating risk and how it changes by agency, has this upheaval or this significant shift in the way that we're applying NEPA, has it affected one sector or one agency more than another?
Yeah, we're totally, from a transportation sector, we're seeing that so much of the permits were like baked into already the regulations. So there hasn't been quite as much shift. But energy, it might not be a NEPA shift, but because of the executive orders, the presidential memorandums that have come out, and then also as it relates to the Department of Interior, put out a secretarial order that was like any kind of NEPA document that had to do with renewable energy had to go up through the Department of Interior for approval. And so that, from a NEPA perspective, affected like timelines. It took a lot longer to get through that approval process. But there's things outside of NEPA that have really affected that sector that has I think, been impactful for that, much more so than other sectors that we've seen.
So I talked a little bit about the CEQ's CE guidance. It's pretty fresh. There's some new ideas in there. What do you see as, and we're talking a lot about risk here, what do you see as the risks associated with that new guidance?
Yeah, I think there's 3 risks really that I look for. Is defensibility risk, really that these haven't been used, this type of has not been used. So what is the defensibility that we're seeing there? Consistency. Agencies are using these CEs differently than they have before. You might have an agency that's using the same CE differently. So what is that consistency? And then also just transparency and perception. I think people are looking at, are the impacts really mitigated? And, are we really disclosing all those impacts that we have as part of this use of the CEs? So I think we really need to look at that and just be careful. We're charting new territory with some of these. And so we just need to make sure that we're really dotting every I and crossing every T.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how the agencies, because CEs are handled by frontline staff typically, and those are not the sorts of things that go up the chain.
Right.
And it's new for them. And a lot of times it takes time for this guidance to trickle down to the field. Even if there's CEQ issues the guidance, the agencies have to take it and interpret it and then implement it at the leadership level, and then it trickles down. So it'll be interesting to see how at least in the near term, how aggressively some of the agencies will apply this new flexibility, the permissive approach that CEQ is taking.
And we have a tool for that.
We do. And speaking of which,
Right.
So we talked about the CE virtual assistant that we just launched. Obviously technology is coming at us fast. We have AI is a part of all the things that we do now, it seems. How is that influencing the state of practice with NEPA?
Yeah, and we're fortunate to where as a company we have a data technology arm. So we've been investigating AI and the use of AI for quite some time. On one side, we see it's being used a lot for an efficiency. Partial drafting certain sections or summarizing large amount of data, and even like response to comments, being able to categorize and understand better those response to comments. I think we're always seeing that has to be on the other side, that there has to be really that human interaction, that professional judgment. We have to make sure that we've got those stopgaps in our practice. And so that's something that we're balancing. We're also seeing the federal government use it a lot more. So Permit AI, through the Pacific National Laboratories is being released. And so I think that there's a lot of embracing it, but we're always looking at through the lens of how can we make sure that when we put something out, our name's on it and that we have verified that what's going out is correct.
Yeah, and I think on that, I'd like to bring Tony back into the conversation. The emerging opportunities with AI. We talk a lot about NEPA because it's there are a lot of efficiencies that are gained, but the sensitive nature of the 106 process and in the whole cultural resources consultation, it introduces some risk potentially. What do you think about the integration of AI and technology into the 106 process?
I think it's critically important that we do it and that we do it right, because there are both legal requirements and kind of like moral and social expectations that we manage that data in a way that's appropriate. And a lot of people who those heritage resources matter to have real strong concerns and valid concerns for that. And that's why it's so interesting that the advisory council was the first mover, that because they're fully aware and acknowledging the confidential nature. And if they're saying they can do it, that's the signal that we need to go there. Also, the academics are doing it. I was at the National Society for American Archaeology conference last week in San Francisco, and there were multiple, large data sets that people are using machine learning on. People are automating, reading Mayan hieroglyphs, putting those into databases and analyzing those. I mean, people know how to read them, but it's slow going when you're the person looking at these. So they're making some progress there. Other large environmental LiDAR data sets they're pulling into systems and analyzing too. So there's a lot of powerful, positive tools that can be had too.
Well, and I think, Meredith, you talked about using AI as a way to review public comment and to sort it, and assuming we do public comment on a document.
Right.
But
Good point.
That public comment is a big part of, it used to be a big part of the NEPA process, and now it's questionable, but it is also essential to the 106 process. How are we handling the lack of mandatory circulation of draft DISs in the public meetings that we typically have for 106?
So it's a new day right now, especially as NEPA has changed so much the last couple of years. Everyone's still catching up and trying to work through how to do that. Yeah, the Section 106 regulations require opportunities for public involvement. It even points to NEPA and other agency processes to do that. And if the NEPA is gone, if more projects aren't subject to NEPA, we always had this problem with cat access, right? That you might still have to do 106, but that discord is getting greater. There are more projects that maybe are not subject to NEPA that the agencies are still required to do some level of public outreach. And I wrote a blog piece about this last year for funding, because that was when the NEPA was starting to say, well, it has to be major federal action, major federal funding. Right. That's not how 106, the definition of an undertaking, is written. My interpretation is $1, and you have to do federal requirements. And so we wrote a blog piece about that last year, kind of laying that out, just so people give heads up on that. But there's more of that separation happening now.
Well, and Meredith, Tony raises a good point that the NEPA is the umbrella statute. We often use NEPA to satisfy many other conditions. Are there other things that you're seeing with the change in the way that we approach NEPA that are influencing other permitting actions that we may have typically rolled it all up into the NEPA process, and now NEPA doesn't serve that same purpose sometimes?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, and just really quickly on the public participation, I think that we're seeing, as I briefly mentioned before, you see that project proponents really are wanting that public engagement to a certain degree, and we've seen that throughout all the sectors, like from mining to water to energy, of hey, we really want to be able to understand that. So I think that umbrella of it wrapping up is really kind of important, and people are stepping outside of that umbrella and doing it outside in different ways. And I think that in other ways, it's the permitting mechanism too of, are you triggering NEPA, and are you going to be doing the assessment of effects based on the permits as well? So I think there's a fundamental somewhat of a shift on how we're looking at things and how they're all fitting together.
It is, the 106 and the public comment opportunity, and then the lack of that in NEPA, and that disconnect is the most clear example of where there could be issues. Are there other things that maybe we're not thinking of that people should be aware of, that because NEPA is changing, that is going to have an effect on either 106 or even other permitting actions?
I'd almost flip that on its head. The narrowing of waters of the U.S. and which areas may be jurisdictional is going to eliminate some NEPA requirements, and certainly 106. Sometimes that was the only federal handle for projects on private property. And if the Corps is doing that less often, those projects may have no federal requirements. So that's certainly a case. And then there are many, at a more pure 106 standpoint, there are many projects, many programs that have program alternatives to programmatic agreements, and some of those have very specific requirements how they dovetail in with the NEPA that those agencies used to do. But if they're not doing the NEPA on those anymore, they may need to revisit some of those very tailored efficiencies that they had achieved over the last 10 and 20 years.
Well, and that federal nexus is important
For sure.
for a lot of reasons. If
Yeah.
you have, you know, an endangered species and you don't have a federal nexus, you may have to do a habitat conservation plan. And so those kind of things is sometimes there's unintended consequences. We get faster at some things, but then we bring in a whole nother element. So if you don't have a federal nexus of, say, a wetland, you may have to, and there's no other federal, you're going to have to sometimes through the Section 7 process, I mean, through the Endangered Species Act, have to go through a longer process.
You mentioned the narrowing, both of you have mentioned the narrowing of effects analysis. And, you know, cumulative and indirect effects have always been a NEPA thing, but it has been part of the 106 process as well. It hasn't yet been codified in regulation that they are narrowing, but do we see, is there a trend that we're seeing that it's starting to, even just through natural inclination because they see the writing on the wall, are we starting to narrow this, or is it still status quo until there are actually regulatory changes?
I think so far as status quo under the Section 106 review, especially for the major infrastructure like large scale transmission, large scale solar and wind, the visual intrusions of those, you know, any layperson you can look at that and say, yeah, that's a big thing. But whether it actually meets the standard of an adverse effect under Section 106 is the question, and that's a difficult analysis. And so I think so far, and then that ties into there's no regulatory milestones to finish that review. And if you do decide that, if the agency decides that there's an adverse effect there, so that is probably an area that the council may pay quite a bit of attention to. And certainly in the council, the vice chairman's comments, was definitely one he flagged. And that would sync it up more with where the NEPA is now.
Yeah, because we're from 7 counties, you know, you still have to do the indirect effects and analysis of the project at hand, but cumulative is kind of a squishy area at this point of, we're no longer seeing cumulative sections. Now, some people are saying that a cumulative is a reasonably foreseeable effect, so it still needs to be evaluated, but we're no longer seeing these just cumulative sections. So, you know, there is this, like, what we relied on each other for is sometimes not always going to be there. And I think you have to really sort that out in the beginning of your project to understand what's going to be required.
One of the things that you had mentioned earlier about the page limits, it got me thinking about, you know, usually the NEPA document would we'd throw everything in there. We'd throw all the 106 stuff in there. We'd throw, you know, the 404 analysis in there and satisfy the 404 permit. But now we don't have that opportunity. And we didn't rehearse this part, but what do you?
We have to be very concise. Yes.
What do we do with that now? I mean, how do we capture those other elements of the environmental review process and provide the public disclosure that is required if we can't bundle it all into one big EIS?
I think on one part that's really good is I think we're focusing on what's really important, right? I mean, are we going to have these significant effects, and what does that look like? And so it's like, okay, we are focusing that on and the public on those issues. On the other hand, you could be missing a lot of information that you may have put then is to like tell the story, right? To have the reader understand and follow through of what you're saying. But really, it's very concise. To get 300 pages for, like, say, you know, an enormous project is hard. And you have a lot of modeling, you have a lot of things. And so now that you can't have substantive information in the appendices, you really have to put that all in the main body, but you have to be very concise and you have to be, you know, very thoughtful in how you do it.
Do you see anything with the 106 if we can't include, you know, some of the either if it's an MOA or whatever the outcome is, that because you need to have that before you get to a ROD generally. If we can't lump that in, where do we put it?
Well, and agencies are going to have to post that themselves online in a lot of cases, but certainly it was routine. Many agencies with the 106 correspondence, you know, the decision, what the effects were, and if there was an outcome for an MOA, those were routinely summarized in the body of the NEPA document and then attached as appendices. Not the confidential information, the technical reports are always, you know, held back, but sometimes the resources were summarized without disclosing any sensitive information. So and that requirement's still there, so that as the regulations stand today, so the agencies need workarounds.
And I did want to, I mean, I keep saying 300 because like huge complex EISs can use 300, but it's usually 150 for EISs and 75 for EAs. So it's even smaller for some of those documents.
And a year and 2 years.
Yes. Yes,
accordingly.
yes, it
so-
takes a lot of planning.
You know, we've talked at the federal level. Obviously, there's a lot of change, but we have a lot of states that have mini NEPA. They have cultural resource laws as well that interplay with the federal requirements. As the feds are changing, and then we've seen this with Endangered Species Act, we've seen this with the waters of the U.S. You know, as the federal role is retreating, the states are taking a little bit more ownership of that.
Yeah.
How are we, you know, like, we do a lot of work in California, obviously. CEQA and NEPA used to be, you know, they issued joint guidance to how to combine those documents. Is that even feasible now? And you know, Tony, to you, how is this 106 process and the potential changes going to affect how state level cultural resource reviews are done? Is there an interplay that people should be aware of? And I'll start with you, Meredith.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that in the past, we've really focused on doing those combined documents to the point where you have a common project description. You have, you know, your impact conclusions are consistent. Your mitigation measures are together. And as we've seen the huge changes and shifts in NEPA, it's become harder and harder and harder. You know, CEQA is still throwing all the information into the document, still, you know, having a ton of substantive information in, and you can't be conclusionary. And so it really is making that change, and we're seeing the shift of agencies going, you know what, I think we're going to pull these apart, you know, not only for the time limits, but the page limits, but you still have to work so closely together because you want to make sure you're consistent with those impacts, those mitigation measures. So it's taken a lot of coordination, but I am seeing them being pulled out much more so now.
Yeah, and it's the same for cultural resources. It's really tricky because, you know, CEQA and then SEPA in Washington State, a lot of those laws are inspired and based on original federal policy, but there are really important local variation. So even the consultation requirements under CEQA are different. The nature, the definition of heritage resources and which ones may matter has some variation as well. And so there's some energy sometimes from the national perspective. Well, we'll just delegate that to the states, and they can do that process. But there are some differences in you know, in how that happens. And then I would also add, in the state of California, we're seeing pretty significant interest and changes to CEQA. There's more affordable housing and some other spaces that really there's been some additional CADXs added there, and so it's getting dynamic at the state level too.
We are almost at the end of the webinar, and we appreciate everybody for sticking with us here. Are there things that we have not covered that you would like to make sure that our audience takes away? Yeah.
I think it's just really being thoughtful in your planning, working with those agencies, because things are fluid, and many of the agencies are now producing documents with these regulations for the first time. And so it's really working with the agencies upfront, making sure that you have a clear strategy that is very defensible, and that you're including that which is the most important information in your documents.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, some of this integration on the cultural resources review with NEPA, you know, a lot of people understand NEPA, a lot of people understand 106, not many people kind of know both. And so everyone just needs to be patient. And especially now as things are changing, there's a lot of significant changes that have happened, many more that are contemplated and likely. And all of us are going to have to work through that together and figure out how to do these projects together. And I think that it's a new day every day on this stuff right now. And I guess the last thing I'd flag on that, you know, we're really focused on Congress and budget levels. And of course, those are prime drivers. But some of these things under Section 106 are regulatory, and that executive agency can continue their staff, they have all their appointees and their staff members, and they can continue to go. So the big news on CNN's talking about, you know, committee fights in Congress, these other changes may still happen this year, even after the midterms.
Yeah.
Or during even.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And thank you both for sitting here and having this conversation with me. So we will have more webinars coming up. We try to do these every quarter. We do these so that we can share our information and hopefully inform you as practitioners on, you know, what the changes are and how best to apply them. We're going to have a short survey at the end of this. So when you close the Zoom, there's going to be a window that pops up for a short opportunity for you to provide feedback. We value that feedback, and, you know, we really would appreciate anything that you want to share, because we do this for you. You know, although we do enjoy doing this, obviously, we do it so that we can be helpful. So if there are topics that would be interesting for us to cover, I love doing it with Tony and Meredith, but we have many experts at ESA, and so we're able to cover a variety of topics. So please provide that feedback. Also, I just want to make sure that folks are aware, in California, we're going to have a couple in-person events in Northern California and Southern California on permitting symposia. So we have bring in agency and clients together to just talk through how we do permitting and help provide some problem-solving opportunities and create solutions. Also encourage everybody to follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we post the information about all these webinars and our CE virtual assistant and our blogs and everything else that we do as it relates to thought leadership in this space. So really appreciate everybody joining us. Look for us on the next one. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.